The sound of her weeping carried through the open window of the weathered cabin, and Franklin Pierce hadn't meant to hear such private sorrow. But once he did, his boots stopped moving of their own accord on that dusty Wichita street in the summer of 1876. He'd been riding through Kansas for 3 weeks straight, following cattle trails and broken promises, trying to outrun memories of a war that had ended more than a decade ago, but still haunted his dreams with the clarity of yesterday's sunrise. The woman's crying wasn't loud or dramatic, just the kind of quiet, desperate sound that comes from someone who thinks nobody's listening, and something about that broke through the careful walls he'd built around his heart since Appomattox. Franklin was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard living, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. His hands were calloused from rope work, and his face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many horizons, searching for something he could never quite name. He'd been a good soldier once, then a better cowboy, and now he was just a man trying to figure out where he belonged in a world that seemed to shift beneath his feet like river sand. The crying continued, softer now, and he found himself tying his horse to the post outside the small cabin without really deciding to do it. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see her kneeling on the wooden floor in front of an open cupboard, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended so many times the patches had patches, and her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins to fall around her face in waves that caught the afternoon light. Franklin knocked gently on the doorframe, not wanting to startle her, and when she turned toward him her eyes were red-rimmed and her cheeks wet with tears. "Madam," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest the way his mother had taught him before fever took her when he was just a boy. "I don't mean to intrude, but I heard you crying and I wanted to make sure everything was all right." She stood quickly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, embarrassment coloring her cheeks even redder than the tears had. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the words and they both knew it was a lie. "Please, you should go. I'm sorry you had to hear that." Franklin looked past her at the empty cupboard, saw the bare shelves that told a story he'd seen too many times in these hard years after the war. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice gentler than people usually expected from a man his size. "That's not your concern," she said, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion and the kind of pride that comes from trying to survive on your own. "I'll be fine. My husband, he's just late coming back from his work, that's all. He'll bring food soon." Franklin saw the lie in her eyes, saw something darker there too, something that made his jaw tighten. The cabin showed no signs of a man's presence, no boots by the door, no hat on the hook, no tobacco smell lingering in the air. "Madam, I don't mean to be forward, but I've got supplies on my horse and I'd be grateful if you'd let me share them. I've got more than I need, and it would ease my conscience to know they went to good use." "I can't accept charity," she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that made his heart ache. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll manage." He took a careful step closer, still holding his hat, still keeping his voice soft and steady. "It's not charity if I'm asking you to do me a favor. I've been on the trail too long and I could use a friendly face and maybe a glass of water. Would you deny a thirsty traveler that small kindness?" Something in her expression shifted, and she looked at him properly for the first time, really seeing him. "You're not from around here," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No, madam. Name's Franklin Pierce, and I've been everywhere and nowhere these past few years. Just finished a cattle drive up from Texas, and now I'm making my way north, seeing what opportunities might present themselves." He paused, then added, "And you are, Wilhelmina, she said quietly. Wilhelmina Zimmerman. Most people call me Willa. Miss Zimmerman, he said, then corrected himself when he saw her flinch. Mrs. Zimmerman, it's Miss, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Or it might as well be. My husband died 6 months ago. Snake bite while he was working a claim up north. They brought his body back, but by then, we'd already lost everything trying to pay for medicine that never came. Franklin felt something settle in his chest, a mix of sorrow for her loss and something else he didn't want to examine too closely. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and meant it. That's a hard thing to bear alone. She nodded, blinking back fresh tears. I've been trying to make ends meet, taking in sewing and laundry, but work's been scarce and people don't have money to spare. I sold almost everything we owned just to keep the cabin, but now. She gestured helplessly at the empty cupboard. Now I don't know what to do. Franklin made a decision then, one of those choices that feels like stepping off a cliff into open air, trusting that something will catch you before you hit the ground. Wait here, he said, and went back out to his horse before she could protest. He returned with his arms full of supplies, flour and beans and salt pork, coffee and sugar and dried apples, more than he should have been carrying given that he was supposed to be heading north for another month at least. He began filling her cupboard methodically, placing each item carefully on the shelves while she watched with wide eyes and trembling hands pressed to her mouth. I can't accept all this, she said, but her voice was weak with hunger and hope. It's too much. I could never repay you. You don't need to repay me, Franklin said, standing back to look at the now full cupboard with satisfaction. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. When you get back on your feet, you can pass the kindness along to someone else who needs it. Willa was crying again, but these were different tears, the kind that came from relief and gratitude rather than despair. Why would you do this for a stranger? She asked. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Franklin looked at her, this woman with her worn dress and proud bearing, her tear-stained face and determined chin, and he felt something shift inside him like the first thaw after a long winter. Maybe I needed to do something good today, he said honestly. Maybe I needed to remember that there's still kindness in the world, still people worth helping. They stood there in the small cabin with late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden air between them. And something passed in that moment that neither of them could name, but both of them felt. It was like recognizing someone you'd been searching for without knowing they existed, like finding home in a person instead of a place. I'll be back next week, Franklin heard himself say, surprising himself as much as her. To check on you, make sure you're doing all right. If that's acceptable to you. Willa nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as he settled his hat back on his head and moved toward the door, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayers. She'd been too proud to speak aloud. Mr. Pierce, she called out as he reached the threshold. He turned back and she said, Thank you, I won't forget this kindness. Franklin, he said with a small smile that softened the hard lines of his face. My friends call me Franklin. Franklin, she repeated, and the name felt right on her tongue, like she'd been preparing to say it all her life. He rode out of town thinking about blue eyes and quiet courage, about the way she tried to hide her tears and hold onto her dignity, even when the world had stripped everything else away. He'd planned to head straight north to Montana, where word was there were jobs for experienced ranch hands. But instead, he found himself taking a room at the boarding house on the edge of Wichita, telling himself it was just for a few days, just to rest his horse and resupply before the long journey ahead. The week passed slowly for both of them. Willa spent her days working harder than ever, taking in every sewing job and laundry order she could find, determined to earn enough money to pay Franklin back for his kindness, even though he'd said it wasn't necessary. She cooked meals from the supplies he'd brought, savoring the first full stomach she'd had in weeks, and found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering where he was and what he was doing and whether he really meant what he said about coming back. Franklin spent the week doing odd jobs around Wichita, mending fences and moving livestock, earning wages he didn't really need and staying in a town that held nothing for him except the memory of a woman's grateful tears. He told himself he was just being practical, making sure she was really all right before he moved on. But late at night in his rented room, he admitted the truth to himself. He wanted to see her again, wanted to hear her voice and see if that strange recognition he'd felt was real or just his lonely imagination playing tricks. When the week was up, Franklin found himself back at her door with fresh supplies and a nervousness he hadn't felt since he was a green boy asking his first girl to dance. He knocked, and when she opened the door, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest feel too tight for his ribs. "You came back," she said, and there was wonder in her voice like she'd half convinced herself he was just a dream. "I said I would," Franklin replied, and it was that simple and that complicated. Willa invited him in for coffee, and they sat at her small table, talking with the ease of old friends rather than new acquaintances. She told him about her life, how she'd come to Kansas from Ohio with her parents as a child, following the promise of land and opportunity. Her father had been a farmer who never quite got the hang of the harsh prairie soil, and her mother had died young, worn down by hard work and broken dreams. She'd married Richard Zimmerman when she was 19, more out of practicality than passion, and they'd built a decent life together even if it was never quite what either of them had imagined. "I cared for him," Willa said, staring into her coffee cup. "But I can't say we were in love, not the way the poets write about. We were partners, friends even, but there was always something missing. I thought maybe that was just how marriage was supposed to be, steady and reliable rather than exciting." Franklin found himself sharing things he rarely talked about, the war and the battles that still played out behind his closed eyelids, the friends he'd lost, and the farm in Missouri he'd left behind because it held too many ghosts. "My parents died before the war," he said. "Father first, then mother not long after, like she'd just been waiting for permission to follow him. I signed up because I didn't know what else to do with myself, thought maybe I'd find some purpose in the fighting. Instead, I just found more death and confusion." "But you survived," Willa said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "That counts for something." Her fingers were warm on his skin, and Franklin turned his hand over to gently hold hers, feeling the calluses from her work and the slight tremor that said she was as affected by the touch as he was. "I'm starting to think maybe I survived for a reason," he said, looking into her eyes. "Maybe I was meant to be here, in this moment with you." They talked until the sun set and the cabin grew dim, and when Franklin finally left, it was with a promise to return again soon, this time in just a few days rather than a week. Willa stood in her doorway watching him ride away, and for the first time since Richard's death, she felt something other than fear and exhaustion. She felt hope and the tentative beginning of joy. The visits became regular after that. Franklin found work at her ranch just outside of Wichita, honest labor that paid decent wages and gave him an excuse to stay in the area. He came to see Willa 3 or 4 times a week, always bringing something with him, firewood or fresh meat or wildflowers he'd picked on the ride over. They would sit and talk for hours, sharing meals and stories, slowly peeling back the layers of protection they'd each built around their hearts. "I never thought I'd want to settle down," Franklin admitted one evening as they sat on her small porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "After the war, I just wanted to keep moving, like if I stayed in one place too long all the bad memories would catch up with me." "And now?" Willa asked, her shoulder pressed against his in the narrow space of the porch step. "Now I think maybe running isn't the answer," he said, turning to look at her. "Maybe the point is to find something worth staying for." Willa felt her heart skip a beat, felt the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "Franklin," she said, and his name had become something precious to her, something she carried around like a secret treasure. "I need you to know that, Richard. He wasn't a bad man, but sometimes he drank too much and his words would get cruel. He never hit me, but there were times I was afraid he might, times I felt small and worthless. Being with you, talking to you, it's shown me what it's like to be treated with genuine kindness and respect. I don't want to lose that." Franklin felt anger rise in him at the thought of anyone making this strong, brave woman feel small, but he kept his voice gentle. "You won't lose it," he promised. "Not from me. I've seen enough cruelty and violence to last several lifetimes. What I want now is to build something good, something gentle, with you if you'll have me." "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Willa whispered, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "I'm asking if you'd consider letting me court you properly," Franklin said, taking her hand in both of his. "I know it hasn't been that long since your husband passed, and I know people might talk, but I don't care about any of that. I care about you, Willa. I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you crying over that empty cupboard." Willa turned to face him fully, tears streaming down her cheeks for what felt like the 100th time since they'd met, but these were good tears, happy tears. "I care about you too," she said. "More than I thought possible. Richard's been gone 6 months, and the truth is our marriage was over long before that in all the ways that mattered. I feel guilty sometimes for not missing him more, but then you appear and I can't help feeling grateful for this second chance at happiness." Franklin cupped her face in his rough hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "No guilt," he said firmly. "You get to be happy, Willa. You deserve that." They kissed then for the first time, soft and sweet and full of promise, and it felt like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. The fireflies continued their ancient dance around them, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon, and 2 lonely people found they were lonely no more. The courtship that followed was the talk of Wichita for weeks. Some people frowned and whispered about indecent haste and proper mourning periods, but most folks who knew Willa's situation were just happy to see her smile again, to see color return to her cheeks and life return to her eyes. Franklin was respectful in his attentions, never staying too late or compromising her reputation, but everyone could see the way they looked at each other, like 2 pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. He took her to church socials and town dances, taught her to ride his gentler horse so they could take rides out to the prairie together, and watch sunsets paint the endless sky in shades of gold and crimson. She mended his shirts and cooked him dinners, learning his preferences and his habits, discovering that he liked his coffee strong and his humor dry, that he was more educated than his rough exterior suggested, and could quote poetry when the mood struck him. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married," Franklin explained one evening as they sat by the creek outside of town, their boots dangling in the cool water. "She made sure I could read and write properly, said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. I've carried a book of poetry in my saddle bag since the war, something beautiful to hold on to when everything else felt ugly." "Read me something," Willa requested, leaning her head on his shoulder. Franklin pulled out the worn volume and flipped through pages he knew by heart, until he found what he was looking for. His voice was low and steady as he read about love and nature and the passage of time, and Willa closed her eyes and let the words wash over her like a benediction. "That was beautiful," she said when he finished. "Richard never read to me, never wanted to talk about anything more complicated than crop prices and weather patterns. Sometimes I felt like I was starving for conversation, for connection." "You'll never starve again," Franklin promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Not for food or conversation or affection. I'll make sure of that." 3 months after that first meeting, Franklin asked Willa to marry him properly, going down on one knee in her little cabin with a simple gold ring he'd saved up for over the past weeks. "I know I'm not rich and I can't promise you an easy life," he said, holding the ring up between them. "But I can promise you'll never face the hard times alone again. I can promise I'll work every day to make you happy, to build a life we can both be proud of. Wilhelmina Zimmerman, will you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Willa pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly before answering. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes. I never thought I'd get a second chance at love, Franklin, and I'm not going to waste it. I want to build that life with you, want to see where this journey takes us." They were married in October of 1876, a small ceremony in the Wichita church with a handful of friends and neighbors as witnesses. Willa wore a new dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Franklin had bought her, pale blue to match her eyes, and she carried wildflowers Franklin had picked that morning. He wore his best clothes, his hair freshly cut, and his boots polished to a shine. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her with enough passion to make the older ladies in attendance fan themselves vigorously. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful, with music and dancing and more food than they'd seen in months. Franklin's new employer from the ranch had donated a side of beef, and the townswomen had pooled their resources to create pies and cakes and fresh bread. People danced in the street as the sun set, and Willa found herself laughing more than she had in years, spinning in Franklin's arms with abandon. "Happy, Mrs. Pierce?" Franklin asked as they took a break from the dancing, both of them flushed and breathless. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Willa replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "I love you, Franklin. Thank you for filling more than just my cupboard that day. Thank you for filling my life with hope and joy." "I love you too," he said, holding her close. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running, for showing me what home really means." They spent their wedding night in Willa's cabin, which was now their cabin, their home. Franklin was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what made his new wife sigh with pleasure, and Willa discovered that physical intimacy could be beautiful when it came with genuine love and respect. They lay tangled together afterward, talking softly in the darkness, making plans for their future. "I've been thinking," Franklin said, running his fingers through her loose hair. "The ranch owner mentioned he's looking to sell off some parcels of land to his workers, good terms for people he trusts. What would you think about us buying a piece of property, building our own place?" Willa propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "Our own ranch." "Franklin, that sounds wonderful, but the cost. I've saved most of my wages since I started working there," he interrupted. "And you've been putting aside what you can from your sewing work. Between us, we might have enough for a down payment, then we could pay off the rest over time. It wouldn't be anything fancy at first, maybe just a small house and enough land for some cattle and horses, but it would be ours." "I think that sounds perfect," Willa said, kissing him softly. "I think that sounds like a dream come true." They spent the winter months planning and saving, Franklin working long hours at the ranch while Willa continued taking in sewing and started selling baked goods to the local general store. It was hard work, exhausting at times, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. On cold nights, they would huddle together by the stove, going over their finances and making lists of what they'd need, dreaming out loud about the life they were building. By spring of 1877, they had enough saved to make an offer on 20 acres just outside of town, good grazing land with a creek running through it, and a small stand of cottonwood trees for shade. The ranch owner accepted their terms, pleased to sell to a young couple willing to work hard, and Franklin and Willa spent every spare moment that summer building their home. It wasn't much at first, just a simple wooden structure with 2 rooms and a porch, but they built it with their own hands and the help of neighbors who came out on Sundays to assist with the heavier work. Franklin proved to be a skilled carpenter, his hands as steady with a hammer as they were with a rope, and Willa designed the layout to make the most of their limited space. "It's perfect," she declared the day they moved in their few pieces of furniture, standing in the middle of the main room with her hands on her hips and pride shining in her eyes. "It's exactly what I always wanted." Franklin wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "It's just the beginning," he promised. "We'll add on to it as we can, make it bigger and better over the years. But you're right, it's perfect because we made it together." They acquired their first cattle that fall, just 6 head to start with, but it was a foundation to build on. Franklin worked them expertly, years of experience on cattle drives serving him well, and Willa proved to have a natural way with the animals that surprised them both. They also got chickens for eggs and a milk cow, slowly creating a homestead that could sustain them. The work was endless and exhausting, up before dawn and falling into bed after dark, but they were happy in a way that went bone deep. They laughed together over small victories and consoled each other through setbacks, building not just a ranch but a partnership that grew stronger with each passing season. "I never knew marriage could be like this," Willa confessed one night as they sat on their porch watching stars wheel overhead. "I never knew it could feel like we're both on the same side, working toward the same goals. With Richard, it always felt like we were competing somehow, like we were keeping score of who worked harder or who sacrificed more." "That sounds lonely," Franklin said, lacing his fingers through hers. "It was," she agreed. "But it's the opposite of lonely. Even when we're apart, I carry you with me, and when we're together, I feel complete in a way I never did before." Franklin turned to look at her, moonlight silvering her features and making her eyes shine. "I feel the same way," he said. "You're my best friend, Willa, as well as my wife and my lover. You're the person I want to tell everything to, good or bad. You make everything better just by being you." Their first year of marriage passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness, and when spring came around again in 1878, Willa realized her monthly courses were late. She waited a few more weeks to be sure before telling Franklin, nervous and excited in equal measure. They talked about children in abstract terms, someday and maybe, but now someday was rushing toward them with the speed of a runaway horse. "Franklin," she said one evening after supper, trying to keep her voice casual, "how would you feel about adding another member to our family?" He looked up from the piece of leather he was mending, confusion on his face. "Another cow." "I thought we agreed to wait until—" He stopped mid-sentence as he saw her expression, saw the way she had her hand pressed to her stomach. "Willa, are you saying what I think you're saying?" She nodded, tears already starting to fall. "I'm expecting, Franklin. We're going to have a baby." He was across the room in 2 strides, picking her up and spinning her around before setting her down carefully like she was made of glass. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to be parents. Oh, Willa, this is the best news, the absolute best news." "You're happy then?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Franklin said, kneeling down to press his ear against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, Willa blooming with health despite the heat and the continued hard work of running the ranch. Franklin became impossibly protective, constantly worried that she was doing too much, lifting too much, working too hard. She had to remind him regularly that she wasn't made of porcelain, and that women had been having babies while working farms since the beginning of time. "I know that," he said, following her around as she collected eggs from the chicken coop. "But you're my wife, and that's my baby you're carrying, and I can't help wanting to wrap you in cotton and keep you safe." "That's very sweet," Willa said, standing on her toes to kiss his worried face, "but also completely impractical. I promise I'll tell you if anything feels wrong, if I need to rest more. But right now I feel strong and capable, and I need to keep working. It keeps me sane." They compromised, Franklin taking on more of the heavier chores while Willa focused on things that didn't require as much physical strain. They talked endlessly about the baby, debating names and making plans for how they'd expand the house to add a nursery. Franklin built a cradle during the long winter evenings, carving careful patterns into the wood, while Willa sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Their son was born in January of 1879 during a cold snap that froze the water in the creek solid. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Franklin feared he might lose both of them, his prayers becoming desperate pleas as he held Willa's hand and tried to be strong for her. But finally, as dawn broke over the frozen prairie, their baby entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his presence to anyone within hearing distance. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Willa's chest. "A healthy, strong boy with good lungs." Willa looked down at her son, this tiny perfect person she and Franklin had created together, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing his tiny features with one finger. "Hello, James, we've been waiting for you." Franklin stood beside the bed with tears streaming down his face, looking at his wife and son with such fierce love it made his chest hurt. "James Franklin Pierce," he said, trying out the name. "He's perfect, Willa. You're perfect. Thank you for this gift." Parenthood was simultaneously the hardest and most rewarding thing either of them had ever done. Baby James was colicky for the first few months, crying for hours at a time despite their best efforts to soothe him. They took turns walking the floor with him at night, exhausted but devoted, singing lullabies and telling stories until finally he'd settled down enough to sleep. "I never knew it was possible to be this tired," Willa said one morning after a particularly difficult night, dark circles under her eyes and her hair in disarray. "You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Franklin said, taking James from her arms so she could rest. "Go sleep for a few hours. I've got him." Gradually things got easier as James grew. His colic faded and he became a happy, curious baby who loved watching his father work with the cattle and listening to his mother sing. They were a family now, complete and whole, facing the challenges of ranching and parenthood together with determination and love. The ranch continued to grow over the next few years as they added more cattle and expanded their land holdings. Franklin's reputation as a skilled and honest rancher spread, and he began getting offers to buy breeding stock from other operations in Kansas and neighboring states. Willa proved to have a head for the business side of things, keeping meticulous records and negotiating deals that benefited them both. "We make a good team," Franklin said one evening as they went over the books together, young James already asleep in his bed in the corner of the room. "The best team," Willa agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to live this dream with you. Do you ever think about that day when you first found me? How different things could have been if you just kept riding?" Franklin put down his pencil and turned to face her properly. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to missing this, to missing you. It scares me sometimes, how much my life depended on being in the right place at the right time, on making the choice to stop and knock on your door instead of riding past." "Fate," Willa said softly. "I don't usually believe in such things, but how else do you explain it? You were exactly what I needed exactly when I needed it most. You saved my life, Franklin, in more ways than just filling that cupboard." "You saved mine too," he replied, pulling her close. "I was lost before I found you, just drifting through life without purpose or direction. You gave me a reason to stop running, gave me something worth fighting for. Everything good in my life started the day I met you." They added 2 more children to their family over the following years, a daughter named Margaret in 1881 and another son named Thomas in 1884. The house grew with the family, Franklin adding rooms and expanding the porch until it wrapped around 2 sides of the structure. The ranch prospered, their herd growing to over 100 head of prime cattle, and they hired on a couple of ranch hands to help with the work. "We've come a long way from that empty cupboard," Willa said one evening in the spring of 1885 as they watched their children play in the yard. James, now 6 years old, and already trying to help with the ranch work. Margaret, a serious 4-year-old who liked to collect wildflowers, and baby Thomas crawling determinedly after his siblings. "A long way indeed," Franklin agreed, his arm around her waist. "And we've got a long way still to go, but I can't wait to travel that road with you to see what the next years bring." "More gray hairs for both of us, probably," Willa laughed, running her fingers through his hair, which was indeed starting to show silver at the temples. "More worries and more work and more reasons to lie awake at night. But also more joy," Franklin added, kissing her temple. "More laughter and more memories, and more proof that love can triumph over hardship if you're willing to work for it." Life on the ranch continued its rhythms through the seasons, the endless cycle of birth and death, planting and harvest, hard work and small celebrations. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, dealt with sick cattle and broken fences, celebrated good years and struggled through lean ones. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, facing every challenge side by side. James grew into a strong, capable boy who loved working with his father and the cattle. Margaret developed her mother's business sense and her father's way with horses. Thomas was still young but showed signs of being the family comedian, always quick with a joke or a silly face to make everyone laugh. "Our children are going to have a better life than either of us had," Willa said one night as she and Franklin sat on their porch, listening to the peaceful sounds of their sleeping household. "They'll have both parents who love them, a stable home, opportunities we could only dream about at their age." "That's all I ever wanted," Franklin replied. "To build something lasting, something that would matter. This ranch, our family, it's my legacy. Years from now, when I'm gone, people will remember that Franklin Pierce was a man who kept his word, who built something good with his life." "Don't talk about being gone," Willa scolded gently. "We've got many years ahead of us still." "I know," he said, pulling her closer. "But when I do eventually go, I'll go happy knowing I got to spend my life loving you, building this life with you. That's more than most men can say." The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and their ranch. James turned 15 in 1894, already taller than his father and eager to take on more responsibility. Margaret at 13 was becoming a beautiful young woman with her mother's blonde hair and her father's steady gray eyes. Thomas at 10 was all energy and mischief, keeping everyone on their toes with his antics. The ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the region, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. Franklin and Willa had earned respect in the community not just for their business acumen, but for their generosity and willingness to help neighbors in need. More than once they'd extended credit or provided supplies to families facing hard times, remembering all too well what it felt like to have an empty cupboard and no hope. "You're too soft-hearted," one of their ranch hands teased Franklin after he'd given a struggling farmer a calf to help rebuild his herd. "You keep giving away livestock and you won't have any left." "I've got plenty," Franklin replied, watching the grateful farmer lead the calf away. "And I remember what it's like to have nothing. If I can help someone else avoid that desperation, it's worth more than any profit." When James turned 18 in 1897, Franklin and Willa sat him down for a serious conversation about his future. "This ranch will be yours someday," Franklin said, his hand on his son's shoulder. "But I want you to know you're not obligated to take it on if that's not what you want. If you want to go to college or try your hand at something else, your mother and I will support that decision." James looked surprised. "Why would I want to do anything else? I love this place, love the work. I've been training my whole life to run this ranch, to continue what you and Mother built. There's nothing I want more than to make you both proud." "You already make us proud," Willa said, tears in her eyes. "Every single day you make us proud with the man you're becoming." The turn of the century came and went, the calendar clicking over to 1900, and Franklin and Willa found themselves in their 40s, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but their spirits still strong. They celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary that October, marking it with a quiet dinner, just the two of them, while their children managed the ranch for the evening. 24 years, Willa marveled, looking at Franklin across the candlelit table. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "Best 24 years of my life," Franklin said, raising his glass to her. "Here's to 24 more and then another 24 after that." "I'll drink to that," she laughed, clinking her glass against his. "Though we'll both be ancient by then." "I don't care how old we get as long as I get to grow old with you," Franklin said seriously. "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I still fall a little more in love with you every single day." "Flatterer," Willa accused, but she was blushing and smiling. "Though I won't pretend I don't love hearing it. You still make me feel young and desirable, even with my gray hair and my work-worn hands." "Those hands built this life," Franklin said, taking one of them in his and kissing the palm. "These hands raised our children and ran a successful business and held me together through every difficult moment. They're beautiful because of what they've accomplished." Later that night, lying together in the bed they'd shared for more than 2 decades, Willa spoke into the comfortable darkness. "I need you to know something, Franklin. That day you knocked on my door when you saw me crying over that empty cupboard, you didn't just save my life. You gave me a life worth living. You showed me what real love looks like, what true partnership means. Every happy moment since then has been a gift I never expected to receive." Franklin held her tighter, his face buried in her hair. "You gave me the same gift," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was just existing before you, just going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. You woke me up, made me want to be better, do better. Everything I am, everything good about me, it's because of you and the love we built together." They lay there in the darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family and a legacy out of nothing but hard work and determination and love. Outside their window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, wild and beautiful and unforgiving, the land that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately blessed them beyond measure. Their children grew and thrived, James eventually marrying a sweet girl from town and bringing her to the ranch as his bride, preparing to take over the operation as Franklin and Willa gradually stepped back. Margaret showed interest in teaching and went off to normal school, returning to start a small school for the ranch children in the area. Thomas decided to try his hand at horse breeding, developing a program that earned regional recognition. Franklin and Willa watched their children's successes with pride and satisfaction, knowing they'd accomplished what they'd set out to do all those years ago. They'd built something lasting, something that would continue on after they were gone. But more than that, they'd proven that love could flourish even in the hardest soil, that two broken people could make each other whole, that kindness and hope could triumph over despair and loneliness. On a golden October afternoon in 1910, Franklin and Willa celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, 3 so far with more on the way. The house rang with laughter and noise, the table groaned under the weight of good food, and everywhere Franklin looked he saw evidence of the life they'd created together. "No regrets, old man," Willa teased, coming to stand beside him on the porch where he'd retreated for a moment of quiet. She was 53 now, her hair more silver than blonde, her face lined by time and weather, but to Franklin she was just as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her. "Not a single one," he said, pulling her into his arms and swaying with her to the music drifting from inside. "How about you, Mrs. Pierce? Any regrets about saying yes to a drifter cowboy who showed up on your doorstep with a bag of flour and a promise?" "Only that I didn't meet you sooner," Willa replied, resting her head on his shoulder and breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and horses and home. "But maybe we needed to go through what we went through separately to be ready for what we could build together. Maybe we needed to be broken before we could be whole." "Maybe," Franklin agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Or maybe we were just incredibly lucky, two lost souls who found each other at exactly the right moment." "Both," Willa decided, "lucky and meant to be." They stood together on the porch of the home they'd built with their own hands, watching the sun paint the Kansas prairie in shades of amber and crimson, listening to the sounds of their family celebrating inside. It had been 34 years since Franklin Pierce had heard a woman crying over an empty cupboard and made the choice to stop and help instead of riding on. 34 years since he'd filled those bare shelves and promised to come back, not knowing that promise would change the entire trajectory of his life. It had been 34 years since Wilhelmina Zimmerman had opened her door to a stranger and found instead the love of her life, the partner she'd needed, the man who would show her that love could be gentle and generous and endlessly renewing. 34 years of hard work and harder times, of joy and sorrow, of building and growing and becoming something greater together than either of them could have been alone. The prairie wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying with it the sounds and smells of home, of cattle lowing in the distance and children laughing nearby and coffee percolating on the stove. This was their legacy, this ranch and this family, built on a foundation of kindness shown to a stranger and trust given to a man who proved himself worthy of it. "I love you," Franklin said, the words as true and necessary as they'd been the first time he'd spoken them all those years ago. "I love you too," Willa replied, the words a promise and a prayer and a celebration all rolled into one. Today and always, for as long as we both shall live and maybe even beyond that. They stood together watching the sunset, two hearts beating as one, two lives intertwined so completely that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The empty cupboard that had brought them together was long gone, replaced by shelves that were always full, by a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. And if sometimes in the quiet moments they thought back to that desperate day in 1876, when a crying woman and a compassionate cowboy crossed paths and changed everything, well, that just made them hold each other a little tighter and appreciate a little more deeply the precious gift they'd been given. The gift of love, the gift of partnership, the gift of a life well lived together, built on nothing more than flour and beans and a promise kept, grown into something beautiful and lasting that would endure long after they were both gone. This was their story, their truth, their forever. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything,